Dry Hollow wasn't the kind of town that got much attention. Nestled between sprawling fields of corn, its life revolved around the harvest. But there was one thing about Dry Hollow that no one could explain: the scarecrow. It stood at the edge of the southernmost field, its crooked hat sagging over a burlap face stitched into a haunting grin. Parents warned their children not to go near it, calling it the harvester. Nobody knew where it had come from. Some said it had always been there, older than the town itself. Others believed it had been placed as a curse, a warning never to break the fragile truce between the living and the things that lived in shadows. What everyone agreed on was this: the harvester was no ordinary scarecrow. 12-year-old Sarah Miller had heard the stories all her life. Every harvest season, children would vanish without a trace. First, it was the youngest son of the baker. Then the twins who lived near the church. Each time, their beds were found empty, their windows open, curtains swaying in the cold night air. Her parents had been extra cautious this year. Every night, they checked her window twice, locked every door, and even sprinkled salt on the windowsills, an old tradition passed down by the elders. But Sarah wasn't worried. She was too old to believe in ghost stories. Or so she thought. That night, as the wind rattled the cornfields outside, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The moonlight painted pale lines across her room, and the distant rustling of the stalks lulled her into a drowsy haze. Then came the sound. A creak. Soft but unmistakable. Her window, firmly latched just hours ago, was now slightly ajar. Sarah sat up, her heart pounding. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. The only answer was the whisper of the wind. But then something moved in the corner of her room. At first, she thought it was just the shadows playing tricks on her. But as her eyes adjusted, she saw it. A tall, crooked figure. It stood hunched, its arms too long, fingers tipped with sharp, claw-like nails. Its face was a patchwork of burlap and rotting straw, its grin stitched wider than any human mouth could stretch. Sarah froze. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The scarecrow tilted its head, its glowing, hollow eyes locking onto her. The smell of dry hay and decay filled the room as it took a slow step forward. The rustling of straw filled the silence, each movement deliberate, as though it were savoring her terror. It reached out one long, clawed hand, its fingers brushing against her blanket. That was enough to snap Sarah out of her paralysis. She screamed, a high, piercing sound that echoed through the house. Her bedroom door burst open moments later, her father charging in with a bat in hand, her mother close behind him. But by the time they arrived, the window was wide open and Sarah was gone. The townsfolk searched for her the next day. Men and women combed the fields, calling her name, their voices swallowed by the endless sea of corn. But no matter how far they went, there was no sign of Sarah. It stood exactly where it always had, at the edge of the fields, its crooked body leaning slightly forward as if watching them. But something was different this time. The stitching on its grin had loosened, its burlap face damp with something dark. And at its feet, partially buried in the soil, was a single scrap of fabric, a piece of Sarah's pajama sleeve. The townsfolk didn't dare touch it. After Sarah's disappearance, the town's fear deepened. Parents locked their children in their rooms at night, nailing the windows shut and keeping lanterns lit until dawn. But it didn't matter. Every year, one child would vanish during the harvest, taken without a sound. No one ever saw the harvester move. But it always seemed different after a child went missing. A little more human, its posture straighter, its stitched grin wider. Eventually, people stopped trying to fight it. The scarecrow was too old, too powerful. Some said it was a spirit tied to the land, feeding on the innocent to keep the fields fertile. Others claimed it was punishment for some forgotten sin. Years later, a group of teenagers dared each other to visit the harvester. They laughed at the old legends, brushing off the stories as nothing more than superstitions. One of them, a boy named Peter, even touched it, ripping a bit of straw from its arm as proof of his courage. That night, Peter's parents awoke to find his room empty, his bed cold. The window was wide open, curtains swaying in the wind. The next morning, the harvester stood taller than ever, its grin impossibly wide, and in its straw-stuffed hand was the scrap of fabric Peter had taken. No one questioned its power after that. The harvester was eternal, unyielding. And as long as the fields grew tall, its hunger would never fade. And so, when the wind howled at night and the cornfields swayed like waves in the dark, the people of Dry Hollow locked their doors and whispered prayers. But deep down, they all knew the harvester would return. It always did.